Hey everybody. So in this video, I'm going to go through our chapters 1 through 10 book talk with you so that everybody is, kind of following along with the major thematic ideas of the giver, some of the things I really want you to be paying attention to, the things I want you to be seeing. That way you can get more out of the novel. All right. So instead of doing this, with the whole class, which in the past has not really seemed to garner as much discussion as I would like, and I mean, I might be wrong here, but I just feel like less people are paying attention when we're doing it with the whole class. We're going to do it this way, in Edpuzzle, where you have to pay attention and respond to the questions and the things that I'm posing as we go through. So let's get into it. Chapter 1, 3 strikes and you're released, page 9. So if you're using the digital copy, the PDF that I shared with you, you guys can kind of follow along with me. But on page 9, um, talks about it right here. So Jonas's mom is talking to Jonas and Lily about the pilot that flew over the community, the pilot that was released earlier in the day. And Lily says, "I feel frightened for him too." Or no, Jonas's mom says that. She says, "There's no third chance. The rules say that if there's a third transgression, he simply has to be released." Jonas shivered. He knew it happened. There was even a boy in his group of 11s whose father had been released years before. No one ever mentioned it. The disgrace was unspeakable, and it was hard to imagine. So, that really makes you think about what this society views in regards to, what do they find important? What do you think it means? What do you think it says about these people that they don't really put up with mistakes? They don't put up with people who constantly screw up. So think about that and tell me what you think. All right, so moving on to chapter 2. So the ceremony of ones and the naming. That's something that's pretty interesting, pages 11 and 12. So here it talks about the ceremony of ones. It says the ceremony for the ones was always noisy and fun. Each December, all the new children born in the previous year turned one. One at a time, there were always 50 in each year's group, if none had been released. They'd been brought to the stage by the nurturers who had cared for them since birth. Some were already walking, wobbly on their unsteady legs. Others were no more than a few days old, wrapped in blankets held by their nurturers. "I enjoy the naming," Jonas said. His mother agreed, smiling. "The year we got Lily, we knew, of course, that we'd receive our female because we'd made our applications and been approved, but I'd been wondering and wondering what her name would be." So, in this society, in this community, we're learning that things are quite a bit different than what we're used to, right? And so, I want you to think about what it must mean about the people in charge of this community, that not only do they not allow the parents to, have their own children the way that, we do in our world, but they don't even allow the parents to name their children. So what does that say about the people who are in charge here? What do they want ultimately? All right. So now let's move on to the ceremony of 12 and the assignments. This is what Jonas was so apprehensive about at the beginning of the book. Page 14 through 16, we start to find out what this ceremony of 12 actually is. So Jonas's dad is talking about his ceremony of 12 and his experience, and he says, "But to be honest, Jonas, for me there was not the element of suspense that there is with your ceremony because I was already fairly certain of what my assignment was to be." So what do you think assignments are? So we go on, and it says Jonas was surprised because there was no way really to know in advance. It was a secret selection made by the leaders of the community, the committee of elders who took the responsibility so seriously. There were never even any jokes made about assignments. His mother seemed surprised too. "How could you have known?" she asked. His father smiled his gentle smile. "Well, it was clear to me, and my parents later confessed it had been obvious to them too, what my aptitude was. I'd always loved the new children more than anything, and when my friends in my age group were holding bicycle races or building toy vehicles or bridges with their construction sets, or that's all the things I do with my friends," Jonas pointed out, and his mother nodded in agreement. "I always participated, of course, because as children we must experience all of those things, and I studied hard in school as you do, Jonas, but again and again during free time I found myself drawn to the new children. I spent almost all my volunteer hours helping in the nurturing center. Of course, the elders knew that from their observation." Jonas nodded, because during the past year he'd been aware of the increasing level of observation in school, at recreation time, and during volunteer hours. He'd noticed the elders watching him and the other 11s. He'd seen them taking notes. He knew, too, that the elders were meeting for long hours with all the instructions that he and the other 11s had during, or instructors, with all the instructors that he and the other 11s had during their years of school. So assignments, you just answered the question a second ago as to what assignments are, what we would call them. But how does it work in this place? Do the people in this society in Jonas's community get to choose what they do with their lives, or are their assignments chosen for them? And then I want you to think about, like, what do you think the pros of that are, and then what are the cons of that? And then lastly, on page 17, this is always something that I like to point out. The kind of in passing, Jonas's dad says something about age. He says here, ceremony of 12 is the last of the ceremonies, as you know. After 12, age isn't important. Most of us even lose track of how old we are as time passes, though the information is in the Hall of Open Records and we could go and look it up if we wanted to. What's important is the preparation for adult life and the training you'll receive in your assignment. So it's always interesting to talk about how, in this community in which Jonas lives, once they hit 12, once they're given their assignment, which is essentially their task, the job that they have to do, how old they are doesn't matter anymore, right? And so that's just another example of how the individuality is kind of taken away from these people. Nobody cares about, who you are as a person. Nobody cares about anything going on in your personal life. And the people don't even really seem to care about that, to themselves, because it's all about, the community. It's all about working to keep the community going. Everybody is sort of parts in a big machine, right? And if you can take that humanity away from people, the individuality, like how old someone is, or here in a moment we're going to talk about mirrors and what that says, it's kind of makes it easier for the community to kind of function as a whole. But the question is that good or bad? What are the pros and cons of that? I'm not going to make you answer that. Let's move on to chapter 3. And like I just mentioned, we talked about this last week, I think, or the week before last. But Jonas makes mention at the beginning of chapter 3 here how he says mirrors were rare in the community. They weren't forbidden, but there was no real need of them, and Jonas had simply never bothered to look at himself very often when he found himself in the location where a mirror existed. So I want you to just think about it and tell me, once again, what does that say about these people? What do they not seem to care about? What do they not seem to value? And then moving on in chapter 3, Jonas has a really weird experience with an apple. And that's on pages 23 through 25. So if we skim down here, it says, Jonas thought again about that incident. He was still bewildered by it, not by the announcement or the necessary apology. Those were standard procedures, and he deserved them. But by the incident itself. He probably should have brought up his feelings of bewilderment that very evening when the family unit had shared their feelings, but he had not been able to sort out and put words into the source of his confusion, so he'd let it pass. So I want you to continue reading if you have your copy open, and I'm going to pause the video here, and I want you to simply just tell me in your own words what you think it is that happened with Jonas and the apple. You can probably find it on pages 24 and 25. So go. Now this is a really interesting part in the story, and this is just another, example of what these people in this community seem to value. In our society, in our world, we value people, or at least we're supposed to. We value individuality, we care about each other, and we don't really place a whole lot of importance on, we don't say a person's worth is determined by, their job or how much money they have or things like that. Everybody has worth. But that might not necessarily be the case in Jonas's community. So if we're looking here, this is when Jonas is in the house of the old doing his volunteer hours, and he's talking to an old lady named Larissa. And she's speaking of a release ceremony, a couple of release ceremonies that had happened recently. One for a lady named Edna, and one for a guy named Roberto. So if we look here, she says, this morning we celebrated the release of Roberto. It was wonderful. I knew Roberto, Jonas said. I helped with his feeding the last time I was here just a few weeks ago. He was a very interesting man. Larissa opened her eyes happily. They told his whole life before they released him. They always do. But to be honest, she whispered with a mischievous look, some of the tellings are a little boring. I've even seen some of the old fall asleep during tellings. When they released Edna recently, did you know Edna? Jonas shook his head. He couldn't recall anyone named Edna. Well, they tried to make her life sound meaningful, and of course, she added primly, all lives are meaningful. I don't mean they aren't, but Edna, my goodness, she was a birth mother, and then she worked in food production for years until she came here. She never even had a family unit. And then she goes on to say, I don't think Edna was very smart. Jonas laughed. He rinsed her left arm, laid it back into the water, and began to wash her feet, and she murmured with pleasure as he massaged her feet with the sponge. But Roberto's life was wonderful, Larissa went on after a moment. He'd been an instructor of 11, you know how important that is, and he'd been on the planning committee, and goodness, I don't know how he found the time. He also raised two very successful children, and he was also the one who did the landscaping design for the Central Plaza. He didn't actually do the labor, of course. So I want you to think about this. She says she doesn't really speak too highly of Edna, and she talks about Edna's assignments and Edna's intelligence here. But she speaks very highly of Roberto, and she mentions his assignments and the things that he contributed. So I want you to tell me, what this says about what these people seem to value in themselves and in each other. Do they simply value each other for just, for existing, for being there? Or do they place their value on people and how much people matter on something else? So what is that? Go. Now this next part is going to be a little bit awkward for some of us, but in chapter 5 we learn about a really weird thing that goes on in this society, in a way that they kind of control people, that's, like I said, a little bit strange and a little bit awkward, but we got to talk about it. So in chapter 5, page 37 through 38, Jonas has his first experiences with what they call the stirrings, and this occurs after he'd had a dream that kind of made him uncomfortable the night before about a girl he has a crush on named Fiona. And so it says here, stirrings. He'd heard the word before. He remembered there was a reference to the stirrings in the Book of Rules, though he didn't remember what it said, and now the speaker mentioned it. Attention, a reminder that stirrings must be reported in order for treatment to take place. So he asks his mom, do I have to report it? And his mother laughed. You did, in the dream telling. That's enough. But what about the treatment? The speaker says the treatment must take place. Jonas felt miserable. Just when the ceremony was about to happen, his ceremony of 12, would he have to go away someplace for treatment just because of a stupid dream? But his mother laughed, again reassuring, affectionate way. No, it's just pills. You're ready for the pills, that's all. That's the treatment for the stirrings. Jonas brightened. He knew about the pills. His parents both took them each morning, and some of his friends did, he knew. Once he'd been heading off to school with Asher, both of them on their bikes, when Asher's father had called from their dwelling doorway, You forgot your pills, Asher. Asher had groaned good-naturedly, turned his bike, and ridden back while Jonas waited. So, think about that. So, what might the stirrings, what might we call the stirrings? And then, why do you think that in Jonas's society, in his community, people have to take pills to pretty much kill the stirrings, to stop them? Why do you think the people in charge do this? What's the purpose? Think about it, tell me, and then we'll move on. All right, we're halfway there. Now let's talk about chapter 6. There's some really interesting stuff here in chapter 6. So in chapter 6, we're heading to the ceremony of 12. And on page 40, we learn about something, another kind of interesting and strange thing these people do that teaches interdependence amongst each other. Now, interdependence is simply, that means like you depend on the people around you. You depend on others. You're not independent. It's the opposite of independent. So here, the bottom of page 40, it says, the little girl nodded, looked down at herself, at the jacket with its row of large buttons that designated her as a 7. 4s, 5s, and 6s all wore jackets that fastened down the back so that they would have to help each other dress and would learn interdependence. So that's strange. These kids between the ages of 4 and 6 have to wear jackets that they zip up or button on the back, not on the front, so they can't do it themselves. What do you think this is trying to ingrain in these people in this community? The fact that they, for 3 years of their childhood, can't put on their clothes without someone else helping them. What do you think the purpose of this is? Now on page 42, we learn about little baby Gabriel, the baby that Jonas's father is taking care of, that they've brought into their family unit so they can take better care of him. So let's see here. It says Gabe was back at the nurturing center being cared for by the night crew. He'd been given an unusual and special reprieve from the committee and granted an additional year of nurturing before his naming and placement. Father had gone before the committee with a plea on behalf of Gabriel, who had not yet gained the weight appropriate to his days of life, nor begun to sleep soundly enough at night to be placed with his family unit. Normally, such a new child would be labeled inadequate and released from the community. Wow. So right there, we learn that if babies don't reach a certain weight and aren't a certain size, they don't look healthy enough, or they're not as healthy as the average baby, they get released. So these people aren't messing around. They're only trying to keep around the best, the strongest, the ones who are going to be able to maybe contribute the most to the community. Anybody that's a weakling, anybody that's going to need extra care, anybody that's going to have any illnesses or physical defects, it seems like they just, get rid of them. They send them off to be released to elsewhere as opposed to trying to take care of them, because these people don't seem to have the time to devote to something like that. So if we scoot over here, it says Jonas's father had not had to release a single new child this year, so Gabriel would have represented a real failure and sadness. Even Jonas, though he didn't hover over the little one the way Lily and his father did, was glad that Gabe had not been released. So it really makes you wonder. It seems like Jonas's dad is taking care of Gabriel because he's a nice human being and he wants to protect the baby. But remember, we've talked about this. These people seem to really value how good they are at their assignments and how important their assignments are. They don't really take failure very well, right? They released the pilot since he flew over the community and made that big screw up. They release anybody that screws up 3 times in a major way. So it makes you wonder, why do you think Jonas's dad is so dedicated to keeping Gabriel alive and trying to keep him from being released? Is it because he cares? Or does he have some other motive? Tell me. Now on page 44, we learn something. We're learning more and more. We're peeling back the onions of these people to really see how different they are than us, and really just how disconnected they are from like empathy and emotion compared to us. And right here, it talks about how they replace babies, which is strange, right? It says this new Caleb was a replacement child. The couple had lost their first Caleb, a cheerful little 4. Loss of a child was very, very rare. The community was extraordinarily safe, each citizen watchful and protective of all children. Remember, it goes back to that question we talked about at the very beginning of this book. What's more important, freedom or safety? Seems like to these people, being safe is a lot more important than having freedom, right? But it goes on. Somehow the first little Caleb had wandered away unnoticed and fallen into the river. The entire community had performed the ceremony of loss together, murmuring the name Caleb throughout an entire day, less and less frequently, softer in volume as the long, somber day went on. So the little 4 seemed to fade away gradually from everyone's consciousness. But now, at this special naming, the community performed the brief murmur of replacement ceremony, repeating the name for the first time since the loss. Softly and slowly at first, then faster and faster with greater volume as the couple stood on the stage with the new child sleeping in the mother's arms. It was as if the first Caleb were returning. Another new child was given the name Roberto, and Jonas remembered that Roberto the Old had been released only last week. But there was no murmur of replacement ceremony for the new little Roberto. Release was not the same as loss. So, if you lose a baby, they just replace it with a new baby with the same name. If someone is released, then the next baby in line to be given to a family is given that person's name. So it makes you wonder, like, these people don't really seem to want to mourn anyone, right? They don't want to seem to have to hold on to memories of those that are lost. They just want to try to, you know, kind of put a new face or a new name on a new baby or a new human, and then or put the old name on a new face and just move on as if nothing was wrong. So it goes back to what these people value, right? They value efficiency, they value being good at their assignment, they value not failing, and they value just continually trying to make the community as proficient as possible. So it kind of makes you think, like, maybe this is their way of preventing people from kind of, being depressed or being sad, which might affect how good they are at their job. If they can just give this family a new baby with the same name, the family's going to forget the fact that their first baby died, right? If they can give a new baby the name Roberto, it makes people not think about the old Roberto. Now they have the new Roberto to think about. So it's just another really strange and kind of heartless way that these people try to be as efficient as possible. They don't want to think about the past. They don't want to think about those that they've lost. They don't want to mourn. They just continually want to move forward. They're almost like sharks in that way. They don't think about anything behind them. It's always what's in front. They don't stop moving. They just continually move, or bad things might happen. So chapters 7 and 8. I always think this is interesting on page 50. And it really tells you, once again, just reveals how these people are and who they are. And it talks here about how each child, when they're born, is given a number, and they never forget those numbers. It says the numbers were rarely used after the child was named, but each child knew his number, of course, and sometimes parents used them in irritation at a child's misbehavior, indicating that mischief made one unworthy of a name. Jonas always chuckled when he heard a parent, exasperated, call sharply to a whining toddler, "That's enough, 23." Look at this line. Mischief made one unworthy of a name. Aren't children supposed to be mischievous? Aren't children supposed to be kind of, you know, sneaky and do things that are kind of silly and stupid and screw up? And, isn't that what a child is supposed to do? And to say that being mischievous makes you unworthy of a name? My goodness. That's almost like saying that, being mischievous and being childish makes you unworthy of existing, because our names are what make us individuals. Our names are what make us who we are. Our names are what separate us from each other. It's us. So to say that mischief makes one unworthy of a name, once again, it really shows how these people value efficiency. They don't value failure. They don't value mistakes. They don't value people who don't pull their weight. They don't value people who slow down the works. Everybody has to be proficient, efficient all the time. Nobody can get in the way of that, or else. It's pretty crazy. So Jonas gets selected, and I'm going to pause here, and I want you to tell me, what was it that Jonas's assignment was? What was he selected to be? All right, so you should have answered that Jonas was selected to be the next receiver of memory. And if we go through pages 60 to 64, we kind of see a bunch of the stuff that's been noted. It all comes together and it all starts to make sense. So if we swing down here to page 60, first off, we talk about the eyes. And I mentioned earlier that Jonas, along with Gabriel, are the only people that he's really ever noticed, himself and the baby, that have blue eyes. Most everybody else in the community has the same color eyes. But it says here, we have our current receiver for a very long time, she went on. Jonas followed her eyes and saw that she was looking at one of the elders. The committee of elders was sitting together in a group, and the chief elder's eyes were now on the one who sat in the midst, but seemed oddly separate from them. It was a man Jonas had never noticed before, a bearded man with pale eyes like Jonas has, and pale eyes like Gabriel has. So what do you think the connection might be there between the three of them? And then we move on to where they talk about pain, and then we figure out what happened with the apple and why that was important. So down here, she says, the chief elder tells Jonas, the training required of you involves pain, physical pain. He felt fear flutter within him. You've never experienced that. Yeah, you've scraped your knee and falls from your bicycle. Yeah, you've crushed your finger in a door last year. But you'll be faced now, she explained gently, with pain of a magnitude none of us here can comprehend, because it's beyond our experience. The receiver himself is not able to describe it, only to remind us you would be faced with it and that you would need immense courage. We cannot prepare you for that. So I just want you to take a minute and tell me what you think that must mean. Like, these people have never experienced pain like Jonas is going to experience. They've experienced physical pain, like they fall down and scrape their knees and whatnot. But what kind of pain might they be talking about? What kind of pain is actually more difficult to deal with, and maybe even hurts more than, falling down or scraping your knee, the physical stuff that we deal with on a daily basis? What kind of pain is it that she says here? What kind of pain might it be that Jonas is going to experience that these people never have? And then lastly, she says, the receiver must have one more quality, and it's one which I can only name but not describe. I don't understand it, and you members of the community will not understand it either. Perhaps Jonas will, because the current receiver has told us Jonas already has this quality. He calls it the capacity to see beyond. The chief elder looked at Jonas with a question in her eyes. The audience watched him too. They were silent. Jonas says he didn't have it, whatever she said, and he didn't know what it was. Now was the moment when he would have to confess, to say, "No, I don't, I can't," and throw himself on their mercy, ask for their forgiveness, to explain that he had been wrongly chosen. He was not the right one at all. But when he looked out across the sea of faces, the thing happened again, the thing that had happened with the apple. It changed. He blinked and it was gone. His shoulders straightened slightly. Briefly, he felt a tiny sliver of sureness for the first time. "I think it's true," he told the chief elder. "I don't understand it. I don't know what it is, but sometimes I see something, and maybe it's beyond." Let's take a moment here. What do you think it is that Jonas sees that these other people can't? What do you think it means to see beyond? Go. So if you look on page 67, I want you to tell me what it was that happened to the last receiver. What is it that Jonas's parents revealed to him about the last receiver? And this is always interesting. This is a big whoa, what in the world is going on moment for Jonas. On page 68 through 69, he gets his list of rules that apply to him now with his new assignment. If you go through these rules, they're, seem to be pretty basic as far as like having a new job and new expectations. But then we get here. Don't discuss your training with any other members of the community, including your parents and elders. You are prohibited now from telling your dreams. Except for illness or injury from your training, you can't take any medication. You are not permitted to apply for release. And you may lie. What in the world? The 8th rule? You may lie? So if Jonas is now all of a sudden allowed to lie, what might that imply about the rest of the adults in Jonas's community, or some of the adults in Jonas's community? So that is a strange one. You are now allowed to lie, and we're going to find out why lying is going to be so essential for him once we discover what his assignment actually entails. So in chapter 10, Jonas meets the receiver for the first time, and he's actually going to be now known as the giver. So on page 74, this is the strangest thing that Jonas finds in this guy's house where he's going to be doing all of his training. It says here, the most conspicuous difference was the books. In his own dwelling there were the necessary reference volumes each household contained, a dictionary, the thick community volume which contained descriptions of every office, factory, building, and committee, and the book of rules, of course. The books in his own dwelling were the only books Jonas had ever seen. He had never known other books existed. What? But this room's walls were completely covered by bookcases, filled which reached to the ceiling. There must have been hundreds, perhaps thousands of books, their titles embossed in shiny letters. Jonas couldn't imagine what the thousands of pages contained. Could there be rules beyond the rules governed by the community? Could there be more descriptions of offices and factories and committees? So Jonas only ever thought that 3 books existed. He'd never seen more than the 3 books: dictionary, a book of rules, and then the book that describes all the jobs and the buildings and whatnot in the society. But in the giver's room, there are hundreds, maybe thousands of books, and this blows Jonas's mind. And if he doesn't think any other books exist in the community, that must mean that most everybody else doesn't think more than 3 books exist in this community. But the giver has thousands. What do you think that means about Jonas's community, the people in charge of it? And what do you think it might mean about what the job of the receiver entails? Go. And then on page 77, 78, the very last thing, I'm going to leave you to describe this for me. But it starts here. The man sighed, seeming to put his thoughts in order, and then he spoke again. I want you, in your own words, to wrap this up by telling me what it is Jonas's assignment is going to be. What does it mean to be the receiver of memory? Once you've done that, you're finished with today's book talk.